3 weeks before his wedding day, Michael Brooks walked into his fiancée's hospital room and told her he was dying. Stage 4 cancer, the doctor said. Maybe 6 weeks left, possibly less. Tasha collapsed into his arms, her scrubs still smelling of antiseptic from her shift, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal. She promised him everything in that moment. She'd stay, she'd fight, she'd love him until his very last breath. But here's what she didn't know. Michael Brooks wasn't dying. There was no cancer, no terminal diagnosis, no countdown clock ticking away his final days. It was all a lie. A carefully orchestrated test designed to reveal the truth about the woman he was about to marry, and what he discovered in those 3 weeks, what he uncovered about the person sleeping beside him every night, would shatter everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the dangerous cost of playing God with someone's heart. Because sometimes, when you go looking for betrayal, you find something far more devastating. You find out who you really are. This is the story of a man who faked his own death to test his bride. But the real question isn't why he did it. It's what drove him to such desperate measures in the first place. Was Michael Brooks a concerned fiancé trying to protect his heart, or was he a manipulator disguised as a victim? What secrets was Tasha hiding that made him question 3 years of shared history, of Sunday morning pancakes and late-night confessions? And when the truth finally came out, when all the lies on both sides were laid bare, why did the woman who promised to love him forever simply vanish into the night, leaving behind nothing but a wedding dress and a note that would haunt him for the rest of his life? Before we go any deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you think you know about testing the people you love. Michael Brooks was 34 years old when he met Tasha Williams at a hospital charity fundraiser in downtown Chicago. He was a structural engineer who'd spent the last decade building bridges and highway overpasses, a man who understood the mathematics of stress and load-bearing capacity, who could calculate exactly how much weight a structure could hold before it collapsed. Tasha was 29, a pediatric nurse with warm brown eyes and a laugh that seemed to make everyone around her feel safer, more hopeful. She'd grown up in the foster care system, bouncing between homes in Detroit before aging out at 18, with nothing but a backpack and a determination to build something better. They met over cheap wine and cheese cubes, talking about second chances and the weight of other people's expectations. Michael had been engaged once before, 5 years earlier, to a woman named Jennifer who'd left him 3 days before their wedding after he discovered she'd been planning to leave the country with his best friend. That betrayal had carved something hollow inside him, left him constantly checking his rearview mirror, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Tasha told him she understood. She'd been hurt too, she said, used by men who saw her kindness as weakness, her forgiveness as permission. They bonded over their shared scars, building a relationship on the foundation of mutual understanding and careful trust. For 3 years, they built a life together. Michael bought a modest house in Oak Park, with a backyard big enough for the children they talked about having someday. Tasha transferred to a hospital closer to home, took extra shifts to help with the mortgage, filled their kitchen with plants she'd rescue from clearance sections and nurse back to health. To their friends, to Michael's family, to the neighbors who waved at them every morning, they were the couple who'd made it work, despite their pasts. They were proof that broken people could build something whole. But 6 months before their planned wedding, Michael started noticing things. Small things at first. Tasha's phone tilted away from him when notifications came through, hushed conversations that ended abruptly when he entered rooms. She started taking evening walks alone, telling him she needed to clear her head after long shifts, but sometimes those walks lasted hours. He'd wake at 2 in the morning to find her side of the bed empty, the bathroom light off, her car missing from the driveway. When he asked about it, she'd smile that reassuring smile and tell him she was just stressed about the wedding planning, about coordinating with her foster family who she rarely spoke to, but felt obligated to invite. She'd kiss his forehead and change the subject, and Michael would push down the doubt crawling up his throat because he wanted to believe her. He needed to believe her. But then came the phone call he wasn't supposed to hear. It was a Tuesday evening in March, spring rain tapping against their bedroom window. Tasha thought he was downstairs watching the game. He'd come back up to grab his phone charger and heard her voice through the door, low and urgent in a way he'd never heard before. She was saying someone's name, a man's name, Marcus, telling him she couldn't keep doing this, that it wasn't fair to anyone involved, that she needed more time before she could tell the truth. Michael stood frozen in the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs, listening to the woman he loved make promises to someone else. When she emerged from the bedroom 10 minutes later, her eyes were red. She told him it was just work stress, a difficult patient case. He nodded and held her, feeling the lie settle between them like a third person in their bed. That's when Michael Brooks made his decision. That's when he decided to test her. Because if Jennifer had taught him anything, it was that you can't really know someone until you see how they act when they think you're not watching, when they think there's nothing left to lose. He started planning it the next day, recruiting his childhood friend David, who was a doctor at a different hospital, to help him pull it off. They created fake medical records, staged appointments, even got his parents involved, though they were reluctant participants who thought the whole thing was a terrible idea. His mother, Patricia, had pulled him aside and asked him point blank, "If you have to test her love, doesn't that mean you've already lost faith in it?" But Michael convinced himself he was being smart, protective, that he was simply gathering information before making the biggest commitment of his life. He told himself that if Tasha truly loved him, this test would prove it. She'd stay by his side. She'd be devastated but devoted, and all his doubts would dissolve like sugar in hot water. On April 15th, exactly 3 weeks before their planned wedding date, Michael walked into Tasha's hospital during her lunch break and told her he needed to talk. They sat in his car in the parking garage, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. He held her hands and looked into her eyes and told her he'd been feeling tired lately, experiencing unexplained weight loss and night sweats. He said he'd finally gone to see David for tests, and then he delivered the lie that would change everything. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer, metastasized to his liver and lungs, maybe 6 weeks left if he was lucky, possibly only 3. No treatment options worth pursuing at this stage, just hospice care and pain management. Tasha's face went completely white. She stopped breathing for what felt like minutes, her hands gripping his so tightly he could feel his bones grinding together. Then she started shaking her head, repeating the word no over and over, like if she said it enough times she could rewrite reality. She demanded to see the scans, to talk to his doctors, to get second opinions from specialists she knew. Michael had prepared for this. He showed her the fabricated reports David had created, the CT scans they'd borrowed from an anonymous patient database, the treatment recommendations that all pointed to the same conclusion: terminal. Tasha sobbed in that car for 45 minutes straight, her body convulsing with grief so raw that Michael almost broke. Almost told her the truth right there. But he didn't, because underneath her tears, he was watching, analyzing, waiting to see what she'd do next. Would she run? Would that mysterious Marcus suddenly become more important than a dying fiancé? Or would she prove him wrong about everything? The funeral for their future began that afternoon. Tasha canceled the wedding venue, telling the coordinator there'd been a family emergency. She couldn't bring herself to say the words out loud, that her groom was dying, that instead of planning a reception, they were now planning for hospice care. Michael moved through the performance like an actor who'd rehearsed his lines too many times. He quit his job, telling his boss the cancer had progressed too quickly. He started losing weight intentionally, skipping meals, wearing clothes that hung loose on his frame. His mother couldn't look at him without crying, and his father stopped speaking to him altogether, so disgusted by the deception that he threatened to tell Tasha everything. But Michael had sworn them to secrecy, manipulated their love for him into complicity. Tasha transformed overnight from bride to caregiver. She took a leave of absence from the hospital, moving them into the living room where she set up a hospital bed she'd borrowed from work. She researched experimental treatments even though he'd told her there was no point. She made schedules for his fake medications, prepared bland foods for his supposed nausea, documented his symptoms with the precision of someone desperately trying to control the uncontrollable. She read to him every evening, their favorite book, a worn copy of The Prophet they'd discovered at a used bookstore on their second date. Her voice would crack on certain passages, the ones about love and loss, but she never stopped reading, never stopped showing up. But Michael noticed other things too, things that fed his suspicion rather than quieting it. Tasha's phone calls became more frequent, not less. She'd step outside to take them, her voice drifting through open windows in fragments he couldn't quite piece together. Twice he saw her wiping tears after hanging up, but when he asked what was wrong, she'd just say she was overwhelmed, that watching him deteriorate was harder than any shift she'd ever worked. She started leaving the house at odd hours, telling him she needed to pick up supplies or clear her head. Once he pretended to be asleep and watched through barely open eyes as she stood at their bedroom window at 3 a.m, staring at something outside, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline to somewhere else. The doubt that Michael thought the test would eliminate only grew stronger. He started second-guessing everything. Was her devotion genuine, or was she just playing the part of the grieving fiancé while carrying on with Marcus behind his back? Was she staying out of love or guilt? And who was this Marcus person anyway? Why had she never mentioned him before? Michael enlisted David's help to do some digging. They searched through Tasha's social media, scrolling back years through photos and comments. They found nothing. No Marcus, no suspicious interactions, no evidence of any secret relationship. But somehow, that made it worse, because it meant she was good at hiding things, better than he'd imagined. Then came the night that pushed Michael over the edge. It was 2 weeks into his fake diagnosis, and Tasha had left around 9 p.m., saying she needed to pick up a special tea that might help with his nausea. She'd been gone for 3 hours. When she finally came back, her eyes were swollen from crying, her hands shaking as she set the tea on the kitchen counter. Michael asked her where she'd been. She told him the store. He asked which one. She hesitated just for a second before naming a 24-hour pharmacy across town. He knew she was lying because he'd called that pharmacy. They didn't carry the tea she'd bought. It came from a specialty shop on the south side, one that closed at 6 p.m. Michael didn't confront her that night. Instead, he made another decision. He would follow her, see for himself what she was doing during these mysterious disappearances. Because if he was going to die, even a fake death, he wanted to know the truth about the woman he'd almost married. 3 nights later, Tasha told him she was going for one of her evening walks. Michael waited until her car pulled out of the driveway, then got into David's car that was parked down the street. They followed her through rush-hour traffic, south through neighborhoods that grew progressively rougher, until she pulled into the parking lot of a budget motel near Midway Airport. The kind of place where you paid cash and nobody asked questions. Michael's stomach dropped. This was it. The confirmation he'd been dreading and perversely hoping for. Tasha got out of her car and walked to room 114. She knocked. The door opened. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, maybe 40 years old, with graying hair and a face that looked carved from stone. Tasha fell into his arms, and they stood there in the doorway, holding each other like people who'd been separated by war. Then they went inside. The door closed, and Michael sat in that car for 2 hours, watching that closed door, feeling something inside him break apart into pieces too small to ever put back together. He didn't see them kiss, didn't see them do anything explicitly romantic. But the intimacy of that embrace, the way she'd melted into him, told Michael everything he thought he needed to know. Michael went home before Tasha that night. He was lying in the hospital bed, pretending to sleep, when she slipped back into the house at midnight. She moved quietly through the dark rooms, checking on him before disappearing into the bathroom, where he heard the shower running for nearly 20 minutes. When she finally crawled into bed beside him, she smelled like unfamiliar soap and something else he couldn't identify. Regret, maybe, or secrets. He lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathing even out into sleep, wondering how someone could hold such contradictions inside their body, how they could sob over your hospital bed one moment and meet secret men in cheap motels the next. The next morning, Michael decided to expand his investigation. He told Tasha he wanted to make videos for their future children, just in case. Messages they could watch when they were older. She'd broken down at the suggestion, telling him not to talk like that he was going to beat this somehow. But she helped him set up his phone on a tripod, positioned to capture the living room where he spent most of his days. What Tasha didn't know was that Michael had configured the phone to record continuously, capturing audio throughout the day, especially during her phone calls. For 3 days, he gathered evidence, and what he discovered was both more and less than he expected. Tasha was having frequent conversations with Marcus, but the content wasn't romantic. They talked about appointments and schedules, about someone needing to stay calm, about how much longer this could go on before everything fell apart. She'd pace the kitchen while talking to him, her voice alternating between frustrated and tender, like she was reasoning with a child or someone who needed constant reassurance. Once, Michael heard her say, "I know you don't understand why I had to leave, but it was the only way to keep you safe." Who was she keeping safe? From what? The mystery deepened when a letter arrived at their house. It was addressed to the estate of Michael Brooks and came from a law firm in Detroit. Tasha intercepted it before Michael could see it, but he'd already photographed the envelope. That evening, while she was in the shower, he searched through her things with the methodical precision of an engineer documenting structural flaws. In the back of her closet, hidden inside a shoebox underneath winter scarves, he found a folder. Inside were documents that made his blood run cold. Life insurance policies. 3 of them, each taken out within the last 6 months, each listing Tasha as the sole beneficiary. The total payout if he died, $1.2 million. Michael sat on their bedroom floor holding those papers, feeling reality tilt sideways. This wasn't about another man. This was about money. Tasha was planning for his death, possibly even counting on it. Had she somehow discovered his plan? Was this her way of calling his bluff? Or worse, was she preparing to actually make him disappear? His mind raced through possibilities, each more terrible than the last. The late-night phone calls could be with a hired killer. The motel meetings could be planning sessions. That Marcus person might not be a lover but an accomplice. Michael had entered this test thinking he'd catch Tasha being unfaithful. Instead, he might have uncovered something far worse. He confronted her that night, carefully, casually, over dinner that she'd made, chicken soup that suddenly seemed potentially poisoned in his paranoid state. He asked her about life insurance, saying David had mentioned he should get his affairs in order. Tasha's face had gone carefully neutral. She told him she'd taken care of it already, that he didn't need to worry about anything, that she'd make sure she was provided for after he was gone. The way she said it, so matter-of-fact, so cold, made Michael's skin crawl. He called David that night from the garage, his voice shaking. They discussed going to the police, but with what evidence? Michael had orchestrated this entire scenario. He'd faked medical documents. He'd manipulated everyone around him. If Tasha had somehow discovered the truth and was now gaming the system in return, who would the police believe? The dying man or the devoted nurse? David suggested Michael end the test immediately, come clean before things escalated further. But Michael refused. He'd come this far. He needed to see it through to the end, needed to know exactly who Tasha Williams really was. So he kept playing dead, kept performing his symptoms, but now he was also documenting everything, recording conversations, photographing documents, building a case file against the woman sleeping next to him, just in case he needed to prove she was dangerous. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to test her loyalty, he'd potentially put himself in actual danger. The performance had become too real. A week before what would have been their wedding day, Tasha received a phone call that changed her completely. Michael was in the living room, eyes closed, listening. He heard her answer, heard her voice go sharp with fear. She said, "How did you find this number? I told you never to call me here." A pause. Then, "I don't care what he wants. I'm not coming back. That life is over." Another pause, longer. "Don't you dare threaten me. I've built something here, something good, and I won't let you destroy it." When Tasha came back into the living room, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. Michael asked what was wrong. She told him it was nothing, just a telemarketer. But he'd heard the terror in her voice. Whatever was happening, whoever Marcus was, Tasha was scared. And Michael realized he might have miscalculated everything. That night, he made his final decision. He would follow her one more time. And if she went back to that motel, if she met with Marcus again, he'd confront them both. He'd end this test and demand the complete truth, consequences be damned. 2 nights later, his opportunity came. Tasha told him she needed to make a quick run to the pharmacy. Michael was ready. David was waiting down the street. They followed her back to the south side, back to that same motel, room 114. But this time, Michael didn't stay in the car. This time, he walked right up to that door, put his ear against the cheap wood, heard voices inside, muffled but emotional. He heard Tasha crying, heard a man's voice, that Marcus person speaking in low, soothing tones. And then he heard something that stopped his heart. "You've always protected me, even when I didn't deserve it, even when they said I was too damaged to save." The man's voice cracked. "You're the only family I've ever had." Family, not lover, not accomplice. Family. Michael stepped back from that door like it had burned him, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed suddenly clicking into place with devastating clarity. Michael stood in that motel parking lot as the truth crashed over him like cold water. All his surveillance, all his suspicion, all his careful documentation of Tasha's suspicious behavior, and he'd missed the most obvious explanation. The one that had nothing to do with betrayal or murder plots. Marcus wasn't a lover. He was her brother. Michael walked back to David's car in a daze. He told his friend to go home. He needed to do this alone. Then he sat in that parking lot for another hour, watching that motel room door, his mind racing backward through 3 years of relationship, recontextualizing everything he thought he knew about Tasha Williams. She'd told him she aged out of foster care alone, that she had no family, no siblings, no one who'd been there when the system finally released her into the world at 18. She'd built her entire adult life on the premise of being a survivor who'd made it out with nothing but her own determination. But that had been a lie. Or at least, not the whole truth. When Tasha finally emerged from the motel room 2 hours later, Michael was waiting by her car. She saw him and froze, her face cycling through shock, fear, and something that looked like resignation. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Michael said the only thing that mattered. "Who is he?" Tasha's eyes filled with tears. She looked back at the motel room door, then at Michael, then down at her feet. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "He's my brother. His name is Marcus. And I thought you'd never have to know he existed." They didn't go home. Instead, they sat in Tasha's car in that parking lot while she told Michael the story she'd spent 3 years hiding. The story of Marcus Williams, born 2 years before her in the same Detroit neighborhood that had produced them both. Their mother had been an addict, their father long gone before Marcus could even remember his face. They'd entered foster care together when Tasha was 3 and Marcus was 5, after their mother overdosed in their apartment bathroom. The system tried to keep them together at first, but Marcus had problems. Serious problems. He'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia at age 12, a condition that grew worse as he aged, especially when he couldn't access consistent treatment or medication. By the time he was 16, he'd cycled through 7 different foster homes. Some had tried to help him. Others had just medicated him until he was too numb to be any trouble. When Marcus aged out of the system at 18, he was homeless within a month. Tasha, still in care herself, could only watch as her brother deteriorated on Chicago's streets. She'd visit him when she could, bringing food and clean clothes, begging him to get help. But Marcus's illness made him paranoid, convinced that doctors and social workers were trying to control his mind. He'd disappear for weeks, then show up at whatever group home Tasha was staying in, sometimes lucid, often not. She became his protector, his advocate, the only person who saw him as more than just another crazy homeless guy. When Tasha aged out at 18, her first goal was survival. Her second was saving Marcus. She worked 3 jobs while putting herself through nursing school, sending money to the shelter where he stayed when his symptoms weren't too severe. She visited every week, sometimes more. Helped him manage his medications when he'd let her. Held him when the voices got too loud and he couldn't tell what was real anymore. But Marcus's condition worsened as he entered his 30s. He became violent, not because he wanted to hurt anyone, but because his fractured mind told him he was protecting himself from threats that didn't exist. After an incident where he attacked a shelter worker during a psychotic episode, believing the worker was poisoning his food, Marcus was arrested and evaluated. He spent 6 months in a psychiatric facility, then was released with a prescription and no support system except Tasha. That's when she made the decision that would haunt her relationship with Michael. She decided Marcus needed to disappear from her life. Not because she stopped loving him, but because she loved him too much to let him destroy himself on the streets. She used connections through her nursing work to get him into a long-term residential facility in Detroit, a place that specialized in treating adults with severe mental illness. It was expensive, nearly $3,000 a month, money that Tasha paid out of her own pocket by working extra shifts and skipping meals. She told Marcus she was leaving Chicago, building a new life, and that he needed to stay in treatment if he wanted to be part of it. He agreed. And for 3 years, it worked. Marcus stayed in the facility, finally on medications that actually helped, finally in an environment where he could be safe. And Tasha built her new life with Michael, the life she'd always dreamed of having. The life where she wasn't just the sister of a mentally ill, homeless man, but a nurse with a career and a home and a fiancé who loved her. But she kept Marcus secret because she'd learned through hard experience that people didn't understand. They'd meet her brother during a good period and think he was fine, then witness him during an episode and conclude he was dangerous or hopeless. They'd judge her for staying connected to someone who took up so much emotional and financial energy. They'd ask why she didn't just let the system handle it, as if the system had ever handled anything properly in their entire childhood. Michael heard all of this sitting in that car, watching Tasha's face as she spoke, seeing the weight of 3 years of hidden truth pressing down on her shoulders. He asked why she couldn't tell him, why she couldn't trust him with this. Tasha looked at him then, really looked at him and said, "Because you told me about Jennifer, about how she destroyed you. And I knew that you saw betrayal everywhere, that you were always waiting for me to turn into her. If I told you I was sending thousands of dollars a month to my mentally ill brother in Detroit, if I told you I took late-night calls from him when he was having episodes, if I told you I sometimes drove 3 hours just to sit with him when he was having a bad week, you would have thought I was choosing him over you. You would have seen it as a betrayal instead of what it really was, love." Michael couldn't speak, couldn't argue, because she was right. He would have seen it exactly that way. He would have kept score of every dollar, every hour, every tear she shed for someone who wasn't him. He would have made her choose, and now, in this parking lot outside a budget motel, he realized that his test hadn't revealed Tasha's character, it had revealed his own. But there was still more. Michael asked about the letter from the Detroit law firm, about the life insurance policies, about the things that had seemed so suspicious, so calculated. Tasha closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the seat. The facility Marcus was in was closing, she explained. Budget cuts. They were transferring residents to a new place, one that cost even more, nearly $5,000 a month. Tasha couldn't afford it on her salary, even with overtime. She'd been meeting with lawyers to see if she could get Marcus into a state-funded program, but those had wait lists years long. She'd taken out the life insurance policies because she needed a plan. If something happened to her, if she got sick or died, Marcus needed to be provided for. The policies weren't about Michael's fake death. They were about Tasha's very real fear that she wouldn't be able to protect her brother forever, and those mysterious phone calls, those late-night disappearances. Marcus was having a hard time with the impending move. He'd been calling her multiple times a day, sometimes in full psychotic episodes, believing the facility staff were conspiring to hurt him. Tasha would talk him down, sometimes for hours, and when phone calls weren't enough, when he threatened to leave the facility and go back to the streets, she'd drive to Detroit to sit with him, to remind him that he was safe, that she was still there. She'd been doing this for 3 weeks, ever since Michael announced his diagnosis. While caring for her supposedly dying fiancé every day, she'd also been trying to keep her brother from falling apart, carrying both their weights on her shoulders without complaint. Michael felt something inside him crumble. Every suspicious action had an explanation. Every perceived betrayal was actually sacrifice. He'd been so focused on finding proof of her unfaithfulness that he'd missed the evidence of her extraordinary devotion playing out right in front of him. "I was going to tell you after the wedding," Tasha said quietly. "I had it all planned out. We'd be married, settled, and then I'd introduce you to Marcus during one of his good periods. Let you see that he was just a person dealing with an illness, not some monster to be afraid of. I thought if you loved me enough to marry me, you'd be able to understand. But then you got sick, and there was no right time anymore. How could I burden you with my problems when you were dying?" She turned to look at Michael then, her eyes red and exhausted. "So I handled it alone. Like I've handled everything alone my whole life. Because that's what you do when you love people. You carry what needs carrying, and you don't keep score." Michael opened his mouth to respond, but no words came, because what could he possibly say that would make this better? He'd tested her loyalty while she was dividing herself between 2 dying men, one real and one fake. He'd questioned her love while she was literally paying for her brother's survival out of her own pocket. He'd followed her to a motel, assuming the worst, while she was preventing her brother's mental health crisis from escalating into tragedy. And through it all, she'd never asked him for help, never complained about the burden, never made her love conditional on his understanding. She'd just loved him, completely, while also loving her brother, while carrying both their lives in her hands without dropping either one. That's when Michael knew he had to tell her the truth. All of it. They sat in that car for another 20 minutes in silence. Tasha seemed to be waiting for Michael's judgment, for him to tell her she'd been wrong to keep Marcus secret, to demand she choose between them. But Michael was gathering courage for his own confession, the one that would either free them both or destroy everything irreparably. Finally, he spoke. "Tasha, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you react." She nodded, wiping her eyes. Michael took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. "I'm not dying. There's no cancer. I faked the whole thing." For a moment, Tasha didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at him like he'd started speaking a language she didn't understand. Then slowly, her face changed. The confusion shifted to comprehension, comprehension to disbelief, disbelief to a kind of horror that Michael had never seen in another human being's eyes. "What did you just say?" Her voice was barely audible. Michael forced himself to maintain eye contact. "I faked the diagnosis, the medical records, the symptoms, all of it. David helped me create everything. I wanted to test you, to see if you'd stay with me when things got hard. After what happened with Jennifer, I needed to know if your love was real." The silence that followed felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way. When Tasha finally spoke, her voice had gone completely flat, empty. "You faked dying, to test me." It wasn't a question. Michael nodded, I thought you were hiding something. The phone calls, the late nights. I thought maybe you were having an affair or planning to leave. I needed to know the truth." Tasha started laughing then, not a happy sound, not even a bitter one. It was the laugh of someone whose mind was trying to process information so absurd, so cruel, that laughter was the only response available. She laughed until tears ran down her face, until her whole body shook with it. Then she stopped abruptly. "I quit my job for you," she said quietly. "I gave up my career to take care of you. I canceled our wedding. I watched you pretend to suffer every single day, and it broke something inside me that I didn't even know could break. I held your hand while you fed me lies about dying, and I promised you I'd never leave. And I meant it. I meant every word." She was crying now, but her voice remained steady. "Do you know what I gave up for you these last 3 weeks? My brother called me 17 times on Tuesday alone. 17 times. He was having a full psychotic break, convinced the facility staff were poisoning him. He needed me there. He needed his sister. But I couldn't go because I was too busy caring for you, taking your fake temperature, recording your fake symptoms, reading to you from our favorite book while you lied to my face." Michael reached for her hand, but she pulled away like he'd burned her. "Don't touch me. Don't you dare touch me." Tasha's face had transformed into something Michael didn't recognize. The warmth that had first drawn him to her was gone, replaced by ice. "I chose you over my brother. Do you understand that? For the first time in his entire life, I chose someone else over Marcus. Because I thought you were dying. I thought these were our last weeks together. So I split myself in half trying to be there for both of you, and it still wasn't enough. Marcus tried to leave the facility twice because I wasn't there to calm him down. Twice he tried to go back to the streets where he'd probably die within a month. And where was I? Here, with you, believing your performance." She grabbed her purse from the back seat, her movements sharp and mechanical. "I need you to understand something, Michael. What you did, this test, it wasn't love. It wasn't even protection. It was cruelty. You played God with my emotions, with my life, with my brother's safety, all because you couldn't deal with your own trauma from Jennifer. You made me grieve for you. You made me plan for life without you. You made me feel every terrible feeling a person can feel when watching someone they love die slowly. And you did it on purpose." Michael tried to explain, tried to tell her about finding the insurance policies, about seeing her with Marcus and not knowing who he was. But Tasha held up her hand. "I don't care. I don't care about your explanations or your justifications. You could have just asked me. At any point in 3 years, you could have asked me if I was hiding anything. You could have told me about your fears and your triggers and your need for reassurance. But instead, you chose this. You chose deception. You chose cruelty. And you know what the worst part is?" She looked directly at him then, and Michael saw something die in her eyes. "The worst part is that I would have understood about Marcus. If you'd given me the chance, if you'd shown me even an ounce of the trust I'd been showing you all this time, I would have told you everything. About my brother, about the money, about all of it. Because I loved you enough to believe you could handle my messy, complicated life. But you didn't love me enough to believe I was telling you the truth." Tasha got out of the car. Michael scrambled to follow her, pleading now, his voice breaking as he tried to explain that he was sorry, that he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd learned his lesson and would never doubt her again. But Tasha just shook her head, backing away from him like he was dangerous. "You want to know what I learned from this, Michael? I learned that your love has conditions, that it comes with tests and surveillance and suspicion, that no matter what I do, no matter how much I sacrifice or how devoted I am, it will never be enough because you're too broken to accept it. Jennifer didn't just hurt you. She turned you into someone who hurts other people. And I can't fix that. I can't love you enough to heal you. I tried, God knows I tried, but you won't let yourself be loved without constantly checking if it's real." She started walking toward the motel, toward Marcus's room. Michael called after her, asked where she was going when they'd talk again. Tasha stopped, but didn't turn around. "I'm going to be with my brother, the person who actually needs me, the person whose love doesn't come with tests." Then she added, so quietly Michael almost didn't hear it, "Don't come to the house. I'll have my things moved out by tomorrow. You can keep everything. The ring, the deposits, all of it. Consider it payment for the performance." Michael stood in that parking lot and watched her knock on Marcus's door, watched it open, watched her disappear inside. And for the first time since this whole thing started, Michael understood what death actually felt like. Not the fake symptoms he'd been performing, not the carefully rehearsed weakness and pain. Real death, the kind that happens when you kill something precious with your own hands and have to watch it stop breathing. He drove home alone. David had been calling repeatedly, but Michael couldn't bring himself to answer. What would he even say? That he'd been right? That Tasha had been hiding something? It felt hollow now, meaningless. Yes, she'd kept a secret, but it had been an act of love, not betrayal. And Michael had taken that complicated, painful love and tested it until it broke. The house was dark when he arrived. He walked through rooms that still smelled like Tasha, her presence everywhere. The hospital bed she'd set up in the living room. The medication schedule still taped to the refrigerator. The stack of library books on the coffee table, all about end-of-life care and how to support terminally ill loved ones. She'd been studying how to help him die with dignity, while he'd been studying how to catch her in a lie. Michael spent that night sitting on their bedroom floor, holding the folder she'd hidden in the closet. Looking at those insurance policies with new understanding, she hadn't been planning his murder. She'd been planning for every contingency, making sure that if the worst happened, both the men she loved would be taken care of. That was who Tasha Williams was, someone who planned for everyone else's survival, even at the cost of her own peace. The next morning, Michael woke to find most of Tasha's belongings gone. She'd come while he was sleeping, must have moved quickly and quietly, taking only what was hers and leaving no note, no explanation, no forwarding address. The wedding dress still hung in the closet, a white ghost of what might have been. Next to it, she'd left the copy of The Prophet they used to read together. Inside the front cover, she'd written something in her careful handwriting. "You taught me that love can be tested. I'm sorry I failed yours, but you failed mine too, and that's the thing you'll have to live with. Some tests aren't meant to be given because passing them requires losing something essential. We both lost. There are no winners here." Michael called her phone. It went straight to voicemail. He called the hospital where she'd worked. They told him she'd resigned effective immediately, no forwarding information. He even drove to that motel, but the manager said the man in room 114 had checked out that morning. Both of them were gone, vanished like they'd never existed. David came over that evening and found Michael sitting in the dark. He didn't say, "I told you so," though he had every right to. Instead, he just sat with his friend while Michael told him everything. About Marcus, about the insurance policies, about Tasha's confession in the parking lot and the look on her face when Michael revealed his own deception. "I destroyed her," Michael said finally. "I took someone who'd spent her entire life being loyal to the people she loved, and I made her feel like loyalty wasn't enough, like she had to prove herself, and when she couldn't prove herself because I'd rigged the test to be unwinnable, I broke her." David was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the question that would haunt Michael for years to come. "What were you really testing, Mike? Her loyalty or your own ability to trust? Because it seems like you set up a test where no matter what she did, you'd find a way to doubt her. If she'd stayed perfectly by your side with no secrets, you probably would have suspected she was performing for an audience. You weren't testing her. You were proving to yourself that everyone eventually betrays you, so you'd have an excuse to leave first." The truth of that statement hit Michael like a physical blow. David was right. This whole thing had never been about Tasha. It had been about Michael's inability to believe he deserved uncomplicated love, his certainty that if someone looked too closely, they'd discover he wasn't worth staying for. So he'd created conditions that guaranteed failure, set up obstacles that ensured pain, not to protect himself, but to prove what he'd always believed, that he was fundamentally unlovable. Michael tried to find Tasha over the following weeks. He contacted her former foster families, but most had lost touch with her years ago. He searched social media obsessively, looking for any trace of where she might have gone. He even hired a private investigator, though he stopped that after 3 days, realizing he was doing exactly what had driven her away in the first place, surveilling, suspecting, refusing to just let her be. A month after she left, a letter arrived at the house. Not from Tasha, but from a law firm in Detroit. Inside was a check for $38,000 made out to Michael Brooks. The attached note explained, "Ms. Williams has requested that we return all funds borrowed against your shared assets, including her portion of the down payment on your home. She wishes to make clear that she owes you nothing and you owe her nothing. All debts are settled." Michael stared at that check for hours. Tasha had somehow scraped together $38,000 in a month, probably by draining her savings, possibly by taking loans she couldn't afford. She'd done it so there would be no financial connection between them, no reason for him to ever contact her again. The message was clear. We're done. Not just the relationship, but any obligation to each other. She wanted a clean break, even if achieving it meant putting herself in financial jeopardy. That was the last communication Michael ever received from her. 2 months after she left, Michael finally worked up the courage to tell his parents everything. His mother's reaction wasn't anger, it was worse. It was disappointment so profound that Michael felt like a child again, small and ashamed. "I raised you better than this," Patricia said quietly. "I raised you to understand that love isn't something you manipulate or control. It's something you nurture with honesty and faith. You took a good woman's love and you poisoned it with suspicion. And now you're surprised that it died?" His father, who'd barely spoken to him since the fake diagnosis, just looked at Michael and said, "You know what the real test of love is, son. It's whether you can let yourself be loved without sabotaging it. You failed that test long before you ever tested her." They were right. Michael knew they were right. But knowing it didn't make it hurt less, didn't fill the hollow space Tasha had left behind. He moved through the following months in a fog, going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. He went back to work, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. How could he care about bridges and stress loads when he destroyed the most important structure in his life? 6 months after Tasha left, David called Michael with news. He'd run into someone from the hospital where Tasha used to work. They'd heard through the nursing network that Tasha had moved to Detroit. She was working at a facility that treated adults with severe mental illness, making significantly less money than she had in Chicago, but closer to her brother. Word was she was happy, or at least healing. She'd apparently told a former colleague that she was done with romantic relationships for a while, maybe forever. That she'd learned the hard way that some people couldn't be trusted with your heart, and it was safer to focus on family instead. Michael should have felt relieved that she was okay. Instead, he felt the full weight of what he'd taken from her. He'd taken her ability to trust, her willingness to be vulnerable, her belief that love could be unconditional. He'd taken all those beautiful, rare qualities and crushed them under the weight of his own trauma. Now she was living a smaller life, a safer life, because he'd taught her that opening your heart only led to pain. A year after the test, Michael finally went to therapy. Not the casual kind he'd tried after Jennifer, where he'd gone to a few sessions and declared himself healed. Real, sustained therapy, where he had to examine the ways his past trauma had infected his present choices, where he had to acknowledge that he'd become so focused on protecting himself from betrayal that he'd preemptively destroyed the thing he was trying to protect. His therapist asked him once what he'd learned from the whole experience. Michael thought about it for a long time before answering. "I learned that you can't test love like you test a bridge. Bridges are made of steel and concrete. You can calculate their breaking point, stress them to their limits, and they'll either hold or they won't. But love isn't like that. It's organic, it's alive. And when you deliberately stress it to see if it'll break, you change its nature. You turn it into something conditional, something transactional, and even if it survives the test, it's not the same thing anymore. It's scarred, altered, less than what it was. The therapist nodded, then asked the harder question, "And what did you learn about yourself?" Michael had to sit with that one even longer. "I learned that I'm afraid, not of being betrayed, of being known, because if someone really knows me, all my flaws and damage and broken pieces, they might decide I'm not worth loving. So I create tests that let me control the narrative. I get to be the victim instead of the person who's just fundamentally unlovable. It's safer that way. Lonelier, but safer." 2 years after Tasha left, Michael sold the house. Too many ghosts lived there. Too many reminders of what he'd destroyed. He moved into a small apartment downtown and tried to build a different kind of life. One where he was honest about his limitations, where he didn't pretend to be healed when he wasn't, where he focused on becoming someone who might someday deserve the kind of love Tasha had offered him. He never stopped thinking about her. Sometimes he'd see a woman with her walk or hear a laugh that sounded like hers, and his heart would stop for a moment, but he never tried to find her. That was the one thing he could give her, the absence of him, the freedom to heal without his presence contaminating her recovery. He kept the book, though. The Prophet, with her note inside. He'd read it sometimes, her words about failing each other's tests, about losing something essential. And he'd think about Marcus, the brother he'd never met, who taught him more about love than he'd learned in all his adult relationships combined. Because Marcus had been the recipient of unconditional love. Despite his illness, despite the burden he represented, despite all the ways he complicated Tasha's life, she'd loved him without reservation, without tests, without conditions. That's what real love looked like, and Michael had been so busy looking for betrayal that he'd missed it playing out right in front of him. 3 years after the test, on what would have been their wedding anniversary, Michael wrote Tasha a letter. He didn't send it. Didn't even know where to send it if he wanted to. But he wrote it anyway, because some confessions need to be spoken into the void, even if no one hears them. He wrote about his regret. Not the surface kind that says, "I'm sorry I hurt you," but the deep, bone-level regret that comes from understanding exactly how and why you destroyed something precious. He wrote about Marcus, about how he wished he could have met him, about how he hoped Tasha's brother was stable and safe, and knew how lucky he was to have a sister who loved him so fiercely. He wrote about what he'd learned in therapy, about the ways he was trying to heal, about his commitment to never testing anyone's love again. And at the end he wrote, "You were right when you said I failed your test. But the real test wasn't whether I could trust you. It was whether I could let myself be loved without destroying it. And I failed that test so completely that I don't know if I'll ever have the chance to take it again. But I'm trying to become someone who could pass it, someone who understands that love isn't something you interrogate or investigate. It's something you protect and nurture and handle with care. You taught me that. It just took losing you for the lesson to finally land." Michael sealed that letter and put it in a drawer with all the other unsent letters he'd written to her over the years. Confessions she'd never read, apologies she'd never hear, evidence of growth she'd never witness. 4 years after the test, Michael ran into David at a coffee shop. His friend looked older, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. They made awkward small talk for a few minutes before David finally said what they were both thinking. "I heard about Tasha." Michael's heart stopped. "What about her?" David hesitated, clearly debating whether to share what he knew. Finally, he sighed. "She's engaged, getting married next year. Guy who works at the facility with her, apparently. Someone who understands about her brother, who's known about Marcus from day one. They're even planning to have him at the wedding during one of his stable periods." Michael nodded slowly, trying to ignore the way his chest was constricting. That's good. She deserves to be happy. And he meant it. Despite the pain, despite the jealousy that flared hot and immediate, he genuinely meant it. Tasha deserved someone who wouldn't test her, who wouldn't question her love, who wouldn't make her prove her loyalty over and over until it shattered. She deserved uncomplicated devotion, the kind she'd always given but had never received from him. David watched him carefully. "You okay?" Michael thought about lying, thought about saying he was fine, that he'd moved on, that hearing about Tasha's happiness didn't feel like someone reaching into his chest and squeezing his heart until it burst. But he'd promised himself he'd stop lying, especially to the people who actually cared about him. "No," he said honestly, "I'm not okay. But I will be. Because her happiness isn't about me. It stopped being about me the moment I turned our relationship into a test instead of a partnership." 5 years after the test, Michael was sitting in his apartment when his doorbell rang. He opened it to find a woman he didn't recognize standing there, holding a manila envelope. "Michael Brooks?" she asked. He nodded. She handed him the envelope. "I'm Sarah, Tasha's friend from the hospital. She asked me to give this to you. Said it was time." Sarah left before Michael could ask what was inside. He sat on his couch for 20 minutes before opening it, afraid of what he might find. Inside was a single photograph and a letter. The photograph showed Tasha and Marcus together, both of them smiling at the camera. Marcus looked healthy, his eyes clear and focused. He had his arm around his sister, and they both looked genuinely happy, like they'd found some measure of peace after years of struggle. The letter was shorter than Michael expected. Tasha's handwriting, familiar and painful to see. "Michael, I've been in therapy for 4 years now, working through what happened between us. My therapist suggested I write you this letter, not to absolve you or to reopen old wounds, but to close the chapter properly. So here it is. What you did was unforgivable, but I've forgiven you anyway because holding on to that anger was poisoning me more than it was hurting you. You tested my love and found it insufficient. But the truth is, my love was more than sufficient. It was extraordinary. The problem was your ability to receive it. That wasn't my failure. It was yours. I want you to know that Marcus is doing well. The new facility has been good for him. He has friends there, hobbies, a life that feels meaningful to him. And yes, I'm getting married, to someone who knows all my secrets from day one and loves me anyway. Someone who doesn't see my complicated life as a burden, but as evidence of my capacity to love. I'm telling you this not to hurt you, but to show you what was possible between us if you just trusted me. This is what our life could have looked like. But you chose fear instead of faith, and these are the consequences of that choice. I hope you've found peace. I hope you've learned to let yourself be loved without sabotaging it. Not for my sake, but for yours, and for whoever comes after me. Because you deserve happiness too, Michael. You just have to stop destroying it whenever it gets close. Take care of yourself, Tasha." Michael read that letter 17 times. Each time he found something new to process, some fresh layer of meaning he'd missed before. She'd forgiven him. Not forgotten, not excused, but forgiven. And somehow that felt worse than if she'd just cursed him and moved on, because her forgiveness meant she'd done the emotional work he should have done from the beginning. She'd examined the relationship, understood its failures, and chosen to let go of the bitterness. While he'd spent 5 years drowning in regret and self-recrimination, she'd done the hard work of healing. That night, Michael looked at his own reflection and asked himself the question he'd been avoiding for 5 years. If he could do it over, what would he change? The obvious answer was everything. He'd skip the test entirely, trust Tasha, ask her directly about his concerns. But Michael realized the real change needed to happen much earlier, before he ever met Tasha, before Jennifer. Back to the moment he decided that protecting himself from pain was more important than opening himself to love. That's where the real damage began, not with the test. with the belief system that made the test seem necessary. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the pain he'd caused, but he could change what he did with the lesson. He could become someone who understood that love requires vulnerability, that trust can't be manufactured or verified through surveillance and tests, that the only way to know if someone's love is real is to accept it and see what happens. It wasn't safe, it wasn't predictable, but it was the only way forward. 6 years after the test, Michael Brooks is still single, still working as an engineer, still in therapy every other week, doing the hard work of unlearning a lifetime of defensive mechanisms and trauma responses. He's dated a few people, always honest from the beginning about his limitations, about the work he's still doing on himself. Some of those relationships lasted a few months. None of them made it past a year. Not because Michael tested them, but because he was so afraid of testing them that he never let them get close enough to matter. His therapist says that's progress of a sort. Better to be alone for the right reasons than paired up for the wrong ones. Michael's not sure he agrees, but he's trying to believe it. He thinks about Tasha often, wonders if she's happy, if her marriage is everything he couldn't give her, if Marcus was able to attend her wedding like they'd planned. He hopes so. He genuinely hopes she got the fairy tale ending she deserved. Sometimes late at night, Michael takes out that photograph she sent him, studies Marcus's face, trying to see what Tasha saw when she looked at her brother, trying to understand the kind of love that gives without counting the cost, that protects without seeking credit, that endures despite impossible circumstances. That's the love Michael destroyed. And that's what he has to live with. Not the loss of Tasha specifically, though he misses her every day, but the knowledge that he was offered something rare and precious, and he shattered it because he was too broken to recognize its value. So here's the question Michael asks himself every morning. How do you live with being the villain in someone else's story? How do you wake up and function knowing that somewhere in the world there's a person who trusted you completely, and you betrayed that trust in the cruelest way possible? You learn to carry it, Michael has discovered, the guilt, the regret, the knowledge that you caused irreparable harm to someone who didn't deserve it. You carry it not as punishment, but as a reminder, a weight that keeps you grounded, that prevents you from ever being that careless with someone's heart again. Michael knows he'll probably never see Tasha again, knows that's better for both of them. She's built a new life, one where he's just a cautionary tale she might share with close friends over wine, a story about the time she almost married someone who loved his trauma more than he loved her. And maybe that's his legacy, not the bridges he builds or the projects he completes, but the lesson he taught through negative example. This is what happens when you test love instead of trusting it. This is the price of letting fear drive your decisions. This is what you lose when you can't accept what's freely given. If you're watching this, and you've ever been tempted to test someone you love, to create elaborate scenarios to verify their loyalty, to surveil and suspect and interrogate their devotion, Michael's story is your warning. Don't do it. Because you're not testing them. You're testing yourself. And the only thing you'll prove is that you're not ready to be loved. Before we close, I want to ask you something. Put yourself in this story. Would you have tested your partner if you'd been in Michael's position? If you saw suspicious behavior, unexplained absences, mysterious phone calls, would you demand the truth or would you create an elaborate lie to expose theirs? And more importantly, if you discovered your partner had tested you the way Michael tested Tasha, could you ever forgive them? Could you ever trust them again? Would knowing they'd faked a terminal illness just to see if you'd stay change how you understood everything you'd been through together? These aren't easy questions. They don't have simple answers. But they're worth thinking about because all of us, at some point, will face a choice between trust and verification, between faith and evidence, between loving openly and protecting ourselves. What Michael learned too late is that you can't do both. You can't protect yourself from betrayal and be truly vulnerable at the same time. You have to choose. And living with the wrong choice is harder than risking the pain of possible betrayal. That's his legacy. That's his lesson. Hard-earned and painfully learned. Don't let it be yours too. If this story affected you, if it made you think about your own relationships or the tests you've put others through, or the ways you've protected yourself at the expense of connection, let me know in the comments. Share your thoughts, your own experiences, because stories like this only matter if they change how we move through the world, if they make us kinder, more trusting, more willing to risk our hearts. And if you're new here and you made it to the end of this hour-long journey, welcome. Click that subscribe button because we tell real stories about real people making real mistakes. Stories that matter. Stories that might just save you from making the same ones. Michael Brooks tested love and lost everything. Don't let that be your story too.